All right, everybody. Just letting people get in here and get situated before we get going. All right. Well, looks like we got everybody here now. Might be some stragglers coming in later. Welcome. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar. We're doing a bit about properties. We're going to go through Cuelist properties, some of the new group properties, and a little bit on the user preferences as well. So the earlier webinar went a little long, so I might go through things a little bit faster than this morning. So with that, we'll get started. All right, so our first thing to do is just how do we get to the properties of Cuelist? So when we're in a multi-quick picker and we have this filtered to Cuelist, we could right click on a Cuelist and select our properties here, and it would open up the Cuelist properties window. We can also get to it when we're in a virtual console view. Again, same thing here. I can right click properties there, but also on the virtual console, I can right click on the displays of the Cuelist and get to the Cuelist properties that way as well. So the first thing we're going to start with, I'm going to start with this Cuelist here. So this is a Cuelist that I previously programmed that just does some things. It's 4 Qs, has some changes. Blinders come on. And then when I hit play, when I get to the end, it restarts and goes back to the beginning. So some of the first properties we're going to look at are these at the top here. So I'm going to skip and go to the play at end option is restart. Our other options we can have here are release and ignore. If they're in release, when we hit the end of that Cuelist, it will release it. It requires another press. So this would be just like if I pressed it to go back to the first Q. If I push that, it releases it there. Our other property is to ignore, which means it's just going to sit there and do nothing. By default, it is set to restart. I'm going to take it back to restart. Now I'm going to go back in here. And now I'm going to go to another Cuelist. So in this Cuelist here, I have my fixtures going to the singer. And what I've done in this Cuelist is I'm going to go to the other property, which is the priority property. So in Vista, we have 4 levels of priority. We've got a low, normal, high, and programmer. Normal is the default. We have a high, which is just a little bit above normal, and then programmer priority, which is the same as when you're working in live. So in this case, I have a Cuelist here that is set to a high priority, and it's set to be on that singer. That way I can play this cue, and it's taking these 2 lights to white, and it's also moving the position of the back 2 lights here. It's hard to see because they're already in that. When it's set to high priority, no matter what I do with this other list, because it's set at normal, those are going to stay as is. If I go back into this and change this back to normal priority, where both these have the same thing, you can see the fixtures moved, so they would continue going. Now, if I were to click on this Cuelist and play it, you can see I'm activating that and things are going there. However, because these are the same priority and it's latest takes precedence, LTP, as soon as I hit my play on the next Cuelist, it's going to move away from there. So priorities are helpful if we want to have a Cuelist that cannot be overridden. And obviously, if you really wanted to make sure it wasn't overridden at all, you could take it all the way up to programmer priority. However, I usually say let's just go one step above as long as it does what you want it to do. So again, with that, I'm going to take this back over to high priority. And I'm also going to kick in another preset here, or another option of ignore release all. That does pretty much exactly what you think it would do. If I hit release all at this point, this Cuelist will release and this one doesn't. So the ignore release all property can be handy for things like if you have a key light that needs to stay on all the time, house lights, hazers, if you have a hazer Cuelist, fog machines. Turning on ignore release all allows that to always keep going. Now it doesn't mean you can't release it. I can manually release it by hitting my modifier and pressing the release there. So it will go away that way. It just doesn't go away when we do the release all function up at the top. So moving on into that, there was next property down there was my ignore snapshots. So when we create snapshots in Vista, there's the option of remembering what our playback states are. And in this case, if I remember the playback state of this being on here and ignore snapshots as turned off, then it will remember this and it will play this cue list. Vice versa, if I have playback state saved and I have this cue list not playing and I activate the snapshot, this will be released. So I'll tell you what, let's just do that real quick. So we're going to release all. I'm going to play this cue list here. And I'm going to create a new snapshot with playback state. I'm just going to do playback state on this one. Say OK. Now, if I play this one, let me just make sure I have this set to, we're going to turn this off first. By the way, these are defaults on both these, off and off. So now if I apply this snapshot, because that one was not running, only this one played. If I turn that cue list property on, play that one again, and apply this snapshot, you can see that this runs and this one does not do anything because it's still running. So again, that could be good for things where you have house lights or other auxiliary cue lists that you want to have running, and you still want to have access to snapshots, but you don't want to have your snapshot remove that. The benefit to that is if I created a snapshot here with the playback state, or if I created multiple snapshots of the playback state, and I want to have this one cue list always running, I have to make sure to have that in every single snapshot. I could do it that way. That just sounds like a lot of work. In this case, I just make the property to ignore it there. Then I don't have to worry about it from there on out. All right. So our next cue list property is release in black. What this means is the cue list will not release until the fixture intensity is out. So I'm going to first get out of here and release everything right now because I have a different cue list that will show us what we're doing here. So this cue list is a single cue. The lights go up and they go up to the color, and that's all they do. If I go to the release in black and turn it off, when I release this cue list, the lights are going to fade down, they're going to move, they're going to change color, they're going to do whatever they're doing as they release. That might not be what I want to see. So I want to see the lights go off first before they do anything like that. So I turn off on release in black. Now when I play the cue list, they're up there. And when I release the cue list, they first go off before they change their positions. And let's go over here so we can see what's happening on the fixture chooser. So now if I do release all, you can see the intensity is going off and then they're moving down. So that's an easy way of keeping your fixtures from moving when they go off at the end of your cue list, or really, at any time, to be honest. Even if you release somewhere in the middle of the queue, it doesn't have to be the last queue. All right, so moving on. Our next one here is HTTP enabled. So this is a kind of a tricky one to understand what it does. Basically, it means the intensity is going to be driven by highest takes precedence. So in that case, here's an example of this. So I have I'm going to keep coming back to this first cue list, and I have things running on it, and that's cool. If I pull the fader up and down, right now the intensity is going to track with that, and everything's good there. So I have another cue list here that actually, all this cue list does is it just turns on these back lights in the back. It just has them on there. Right now, this is not set to HTTP. So if I were to bring the fader down on this first cue list and play through things, actually, let me turn that down. The lights will go off. Let me just check to make sure I have the property set. Yeah, let me turn that off first. Let's do this the right way. All right, so this is the expected action. HTTP is off right now on this cue list. If I play through them, the lights are going to go off because the fader is down on this cue list, and we're working with latest takes precedence. So this is the latest action to happen, and obviously nothing's there. If I push the fader up, there it is. So now if I turn HTTP on in this cue list, Now when I bring this fader down, the HTP of this is driving these fixtures intensity, so they will not go down when I do that. Now, if I bring the fader down, they go down on this Cuelist, but allows me to keep a intensity happening all the time. It's important to note that when we do a store all function, when we use store all, it sets a couple of these items automatically, and HTP is one of them. Also down here, the fader intensity mode and some of this other stuff as well, which we're going to do and get into next. Our next thing is the fader type. And what do we want to do? So all this I've been doing so far is just showing the intensity on the fader going up and down. We have another option here called all features. Move to the, we'll take this to intensity only first. Release all. So here I have another Cuelist where the lights go up and they move. Release all that again. Do this with them up, the fader up. So the lights come up and they move. Fader controls the intensity. That's it. If I change this fader type to all features, what's going to happen is this fader is controlling everything now. So it's controlling them from their default position, which is down, and in open white, and they're going up. Now what I have going on here is this is a color wheel fixture. It's going through multiple slots as it goes up, so we can really see how it's also fading the color as well. So this is a little handy. This can be a handy way of doing it if you want to track a light from, say, one spot on the stage, the other spot of the stage, and you want to follow someone with a light manually. You could set up two cues and set it to all features and just sort of fade up and down between the two. So on some of the other consoles, on Evo, this was the old Mode 2 fader. Used to use this for effects. If I had a circle effect on this fader, it would allow me to increase the size and the speed and the intensity all at the same time. It's kind of been overridden by the effects masters now, but it's still something that's a handy little option to have in there. All right. So all features, probably the most used property that I change, I would say, is the fader autoplay from none to autoplay and release. That's what I normally do. What this means is I don't have to push the play button when I move the fader, or I don't have to push release when I bring the fader down. So in this case, I'm going to go back to my first Cuelist again. If I change this to autoplay, now when I bring the fader up, it plays in my first cue, and I can keep moving, bouncing through it, and I'll keep going. When I bring the fader down, it's still playing, nothing has happened. The next step down will be autoplay and release. So in that case, I push the fader up, they play through things, I play through, bring the fader down, it releases automatically. This is a great way of knowing that only what you have the faders up is what's playing, so that way you can slam your fader down at the end of it and make sure that you have released the Cuelist. And again, auto release, kind of the same thing. You can push fader up and play into it, and then bring the fader down to release it. Kind of does what it sounds like. Next up, at least in this version of Vista, we have a fader intensity mode. So what this means, actually I need to go to a different Cuelist to do this. So in the current version build of Vista, we have the two options called normal and submaster. In the next build of Vista, these have been changed between manual and programmed. What this means is, does the fader control the intensity fade, or is it controlled by the programmed time that's in there? So in this case, this is a 2 seconds. Actually, let me let me edit that real quick and make this a little longer so we can see. So we can see this much better. So I have both the property set to autoplay and release. So as soon as I move the fader, the cue starts and the lights are slowly fading up in their 10 seconds. This property is fader intensity mode as normal. So it's going by the program's cue time on there. If I take it to submaster, what this is going to do is it's going to track with what I do with the fader. So in that case, when I push the fader up, I can push the fader up quickly, and the cue time is still going, but the intensity is tracking on how fast I push the fader up. So it can be helpful for something that you know you want to do as a submaster, do differently from everything else. And like I said, that option is changed, different names in the next version. It would be submaster becomes manual and normal becomes programmed. All right. So next thing we have here is release on override. What this means is that the Cuelist will release if every single parameter in that Cuelist is being overridden by another Cuelist or another item in general. So this Cuelist is no longer contributing to the output that you're seeing on stage. Every single parameter has to be overridden. If one channel of anything is not, then it will not release. In this case, I've actually put this together so that this will release properly. So this Cuelist here has just the blinders in it. That's all. This first Cuelist actually has the blinders coming on also in the fourth cue. So in this cue, I've turned on the property for release when overridden. And if I play through my first list, I can see, yep, lights are happening. And now if I hit Q4, Q4 has blinders in it. All of these, all those fixtures are in it. And you can see as soon as I hit Q4, this one was released because it was no longer contributing. It's all being driven there. The challenge to this now is that this is completely released. So if I go back to the beginning of this, my blinders have gone off, which might be what I wanted to have happen. But if I didn't want them to have happen, I'd have to redo, play this one. So the release all, or the release on override is kind of a tough one. It is very situation specific on what you want to have happen, and the fact that it requires every single parameter be overridden to make it a little tougher to use. So if you have a specific case where this works, it's probably exactly what you need to have what you need. So all right, so our next cue list, our next property is the auto move in black. And for that one, I'm going to create a new cue list. And I'm actually going to go into the Cuelist properties here and turn on auto move in black. So auto move in black does pretty much exactly what it says there. What will happen is anytime I create a new cue, it's going to automatically mark to the previous cue. This might be helpful for theater show or some show where you absolutely do not want to see lights moving or changing or anything like that. So it's automatically adding the events to that first cue of what's happening. Now on some of this stuff, because I'm going cue to cue without going out, it won't do it. It will not mark it. So it's only going to mark the events that have that the fixtures go to 0 in or go intensity down on. It's one of those features. Again, you have to situation to use it. For me, not often using move in black for an entire cue list, but it's something that's there if you do need to use it that way. And it will continue to add every single move in black or mark cue to every single cue as you go through. All right. And to go along with that, minimum move in black cue length, just a timing adjustment on that. Next one down here is auto run on show load. So this one kind of goes hand in hand with a user preference that I'm going to talk about after we get through all this, which is automatically loading a show. In this case, this one could also, we could set a Cuelist to run automatically as soon as the show is loaded up. It could be your general stage wash, it could be house lights, it could be anything, but it allows us to set a Cuelist to do that without any other input. And multiple Cuelists can be set to that as well, so just off and on that one. And exclude from store. So here's another one that can be helpful, again, for stuff where you have house lights or a specific fixture that you don't want to store into any other queues. This store means that it's going to, whenever you store all or store part, it won't, whatever's running this queue list will not be added into that. So in this case, if I had these blinders up and I wanted to store to a new queue, let's just do this. Let's turn on those and that. And I took a store and I wanted to add this to a new queue. Actually, let's just do, I gotta do new. I'm gonna find out where I did with that queue list. I think this is the one. And there we go. All right, so this was up when I stored this queue. However, with ignore store turned on, it did not get stored into this other queue list when I did that. So again, handy on a queue list that you want to make sure that you don't keep doing it. For me, it would be house lights would be on a fader, and I would go and program my whole show with the house lights on, and then I'd forget about it, and then have house lights programmed into probably multiple queues in my show. Not every queue, but a lot of them, enough to make it a real pain. All right. So these are our main properties. At the bottom here, we can save these. We could set up a very specific setting of how we want to do things. We could save this as a user default. So this way, anytime we create a new queue list in the show, it's going to use those defaults. If we change something, we could reset it back to that show default if we needed to. And then lastly here, we can reset the factory defaults. So this would take it back to its normal settings on everything here. If I hit that, you see that's a couple of things that are changed. Our next tab over in Cuelist properties is the timing tab. This has got a couple things that are worth taking a note at. The release timing is by default 2 seconds. So if you wanted something to release faster, we could adjust that. Playback rate. This is one to watch out for because this is, I've seen this one bite some people in the past. It's just a percentage of how fast you're going to play back your cues. So if you have a queue list that everything's set at a 2-second fade time and you change your playback rate to 50%, that means everything's going to happen in 4 seconds. If we bring it all the way down to 0, it's not going to play back at all. So you have to watch out for this. Vice versa, if we take it up, it's going to play back a lot faster. So this is kind of important to know that if for some reason you're running through your queues and they seem to be going very slow, or a queue list is not playing at all, you've hit the play and nothing is happening, come back in here and check to make sure that this hasn't gotten changed. It is possible that someone could accidentally change this. Time code, the disabled, enabled, and locked, these are things we talked about last week with our time code and armed and whatnot. And then down here in the bottom, it currently doesn't work in this version, but in the next version, this will work as the default queue follow mode. What this will do is it's going to say what our default mode here is on this. So right now, by default, halt is your mode for every queue. If you wanted these to all be follow queues or start queues or something like that, we could adjust the property to have these be different like that. It could be helpful for time code queues. So you can make every single queue a time code queue automatically and not have to worry about change it later. Our next one over here is chase. So this is a way of make these queues chase through everything quite simply. There's not a whole lot of bells and whistles here. It does add a little bit of extra fun stuff you can do with chasing the same fixtures over and over again. Some things you can't do with effects, but for the most part, chase is very basic. We're going to go in here, and I have another Q list up. So in this Q list here, oops, I should push the fader up. Very simple. I'm cycling through the blue, the red, and the amber fixtures. Nothing too crazy. In the Q list properties, if I enable this in the chase, it's going to just keep going all the way through. I could do forwards, backwards, bounce. I've used bounce before. It's a fun effect, especially if you're trying to make like a warning light on a stage or something. And then random. Random isn't going to look too random since there's only 3 Qs, but if you had a lot, it would just grab random steps through everything. Tracking, if you wanted to track or non-tracked. And then crossfade is how much these lights are going to overlap. So if I take it to just up a bump, they're going to snap between each step. And then the BPM, how fast we want it to go. So these chase items here can also be controlled from super playback. So for example, if I put this chase Q list on the super playback, and we're in the super playback mode, the playback mode, we have this button here called chase. And when this is inactive, I can take a Q list, I can actually turn it into a chase by using these if I want to, or stop it from chasing. But in this case, I have access to all those parameters I just had. I also have a sync button here where I can tap in my BPM. There we go, make it really fast. And then a rate, and I can adjust things in here as well using the encoders on the console. So again, this is another good spot to bring this up and kind of make sure everyone understands that because you can activate a chase, you can take any Q list and turn it into a chase just by hitting a couple buttons here. It would be easy for me to accidentally take the Q list I don't want to chase and turn it into a chase by simply going to chase and hitting the button. So you have to really watch out for this as in case things are not doing what you think they should be doing. So there we go. Yeah, so if every Q you have is playing ridiculously fast and just keeps going and going, even though that they are all set to halt, we can see that right here. They're still set to halt. It could be that it's been turned into a chase. And to turn that off, I just take off whichever direction they're going. All right. So moving on. Again, I can save these settings too. The MIDI, we went through this in the MIDI webinar last week, so I'm not going to really hit any of this. Same with audio. We didn't really do, we did some audio in there, but there really isn't anything else left on there. Finally, we have notes. If you really want to add notes to a Q list for any reason, you could do that here. All right. So something new in Vista 3 is in the groups, we actually have properties for the groups. This was not in Vista 2. I'm going to do that same with other properties. Right click on the group, say properties. So here are our properties in the groups. Same sort of properties that we had in QList. So there's not really much else to say on these. Is we have an ignore release all, and by default that's turned off. Ignore snapshots and ignore or exclude from store and update. So these are kind of the normal options. Now we could turn this on. So if you have a situation where you want to have a group on a fader somewhere, let's do this. Let's go there and do this. And I have my group on the fader, but I've been switching through a lot of pages and I don't know where I'm at. There we go. That's more. These lights are hanging. They're not in the, let me close that. So they're not in the programmer. They're not really doing anything. And if I hit release all when that's turned off, I could get rid of them. So let's go back in here. So right now, ignore release all. When I hit release all, they stay on. So that's where I would get lost if I couldn't find them. And if I turn ignore release all off, now I could actually release that group no matter where it is. Personally, I like knowing that groups do not release when I hit release all. Again, it comes back to wanting to do things with house lights or some other fixture that I want to leave on, especially in corporate. It's a gobo, it's a logo, and I put it on a group because it's simple. But you don't have to do that. You don't have to stay with that all the time. Same with ignore snapshots. I can turn that on and off and exclude from the store and update. So these are all new in Vista 3. All right, so are there any questions on the Cuelist properties, group properties, anything like that? Is there anything I missed?
We have no questions.
All right. Maybe we'll see if everyone's still with us so far. So next thing I want to go into is a bit on the user preferences, and we're going to go through these.
We just got another random question in there. How would you use start on the queue list instead of halt? You wouldn't on the first queue.
Yeah, you went on the first queue. That was something that we went over with the programming a couple weeks ago. Differences between start, is it the if this one is set to start, these two queues will start playing the exact same time, versus if it's set to follow, this one will start playing after this one's finished playing. So it's just another way of doing the same thing. All right. User preferences. So there's a lot in the user preferences, and it seems to be growing from build to build sometimes. So we'll start right here at the beginning. In our user preferences, when we open the window, we get to our general. General tab is, everything that's kind of basics of using Vista. So our first thing is our auto show load. So this would go along with the also using the Cuelist, the autoplay Cuelist, or play on show load. I could select a show to automatically start up. So if you had a specific show file you always wanted to use, or a master show file, you could do that here. The next part down here is auto-generate fixture type groups. So what this is when you create, patch in new fixtures, you're getting this group icon here automatically. And that's what this does. This turns this on and off. This is different from in the layout properties where we can show this or not. This is actually creating that group altogether. So this, no matter what you did in the layout properties, if you had your groups set to always show, if this was turned off, you'd never see any groups because they weren't actually being made. So again, by default, this comes on. If that's something you don't want to see happen all the time, then flip this off and go on your way. The next one is preview parked fixtures. So let's go in here and take some fixtures, turn them on. Oops, let me. There we go. That's more like it. So let's say I wanted to park these, the position of these, and the color in white all the time. So that's parking position and color. That way, from here on out, if I grab these fixtures and try to do something else with them, they won't do anything. Even though they're showing they're doing something here, they won't do it. So that's this user preference right here, right now. So right now, it's set to preview parked fixtures is turned off. So that means these are going to show, even though there's a red border showing that they're parked, but they're going to still show that they're doing the programming that the other fixtures are, even though they're not. If I kick that user preference on, now these fixtures are going to show exactly what they're parked to be doing. So no matter what I do here, they don't change at all. So this might be, personally, I would prefer it to look like this all the time. It's a little easier, then I know exactly what's going on. But since it's a user preference, you can do it whichever way you like to do it. All right, next section down here is presets. Enable quick picker page filtering. So as we went in before a couple weeks ago with presets and all that fun stuff, we have this filtering options down here. Close that for a moment. Where when I have fixtures, let me unpark these two while I'm at it. When I'm using the presets out of here, I'm filtering what I'm recalling based on what this filtering is here as well. So in this case, not only am I only seeing color presets, but I'm not seeing anything. I'm not recalling anything else from this. So, for example, let's do this. Let's make a preset. We're going to do it as an all. Yep, that works. Okay, and we're going to take them to up and put them in blue. And I'm going to create a new preset with position and color in there and say, okay, great. So now when I grab these lights, and if I were to take that preset from position, actually, hold on a sec, let me just clear this, start it from scratch so we can see, turn them on. So if I have this set to filter by position, they're only going to call back to position. They're not going to call back to blue. Versus, and also here, if I call back blue or the color, they're only going to bring that color. So this is filtering these by that. If I take that user preference and turn that off, the filtering still remains of what I'm going to see here. However, it's not going to. I'm no longer be filtering when I apply the preset. So in this case, I'm looking at position only, but I'm going to get both position and color because it's not filtering what it's applying based on that. So another little setting to watch out for if for some reason things are not applying back the way you think they should be, that's because that might be disabled. Next one down is using the home preset for clearing fixtures and features. We have the ability to create a home, adjust the home preset of your fixtures. So let's do this. Tilt these out. Let's say I want to make this my home preset. By default, it was straight down. But in this case, if I wanted to say home update position on those, okay. So now when I hit clear and turn those on, they're going to go to that spot. That's because this preference is turned on where I'm using the home preset when clearing fixtures. If I turn this preset off or turn that function off, now when I hit clear, they're going to go back to their defaults, which is straight down, and they're going to ignore that home preset. If I have that turned off, I could still go to the home preset. It just won't go when I hit clear. So if I go to home, they're going to go back to where that home is. Just when I do clear, they're going to go back to their actual clear default state. Next down, zoom with mouse wheel. Pretty self-explanatory. We can zoom in and out of the fixture layouts with our mouse wheel when it's connected. Auto hide command line. It allows the command line here at the bottom to go away when there's no commands being input. You can turn it on and off. Frankly, I don't like it going away because then it's going to kind of reformat my screen each time. So I'd prefer the command line to stay there. If I wanted to get rid of it, I would get rid of it. So, and also show command line in a new show. If you never want to see the command line in a new show, turn that off. However, when we do that, we lose some of the features of being able to use the keyboard for some quick commands and things like that. So it might not be the best thing to take out. Down in the audio, if we have a Cuelist with audio in it, we can mute the audio on a tracking backup slave so they're not both playing the audio, and also adjust the volume of that. Something new down here, which wasn't in previous Vista versions, is now the location. So this location helps with the sunrise and sunset time and date effects or events. We can set a location as to where we are. Unfortunately, if you're in North America or the US, you got to scroll all the way down here to find something. But we can say, hey, we're in, you know, this city, and it's going to populate longitude and latitude for us. So this is going to then help calculate when sunrise and sunset is and the time and date effects, or time and date events. So under tools, date and time events. Here's I can select a Cuelist to play and my time of day be at sunrise, and I can offset it by a few minutes or sunset. So to get this to work properly, you really have to set your latitude and longitude. A question that came up in an earlier webinar is, this is not based on, this doesn't mean you have to be connected to the internet for this. However, this doesn't have any effect on the computer clock. So if your computer clock, which I don't have up here right now, drifts, then your latitude and longitude will be fine, but your time and date event might still drift because the computer thinks it's at a different time than it really is. So you may need, if you really have this, has to be critical all the time, you may need to still have some sort of network access to a time server in order for it to stay the time to be synced up properly. And at the bottom here, we've got this use these settings for new shows. So if you've made some adjustments here to things you want to see, we could set it up here so that we're going to always use those settings or restore back to factory defaults. Next, over here in our naming tab, this is just how we default name things. We have a hashtag or a pound sign, which is the user ID, and then also the $sign for the item name. So we could adjust how these are being named. Let's say you just wanted to reverse this and you have the name first and the ID second, you could do that. Or if you had something you always wanted to have be names, like let's say we always wanted like have FX be FX and then the name, we could do that as well. So just little other ways of customizing what you want to see. All right, in our console tab, we have some settings for the physical consoles. So some of the first ones we have is fader action threshold at top and bottom. This lets us adjust where that fader hits its top and its bottom. If for some reason you've got a jittery fader or a fader starting to go, especially on older consoles, we could go and we could adjust that threshold so that maybe full, when the fader's all the way up, it actually goes to full a little earlier than it would by default. So a little bit extra adjustments on those. And then on encoders, we have our encoder sensitivity. So this allows the encoder to move a little faster or slower on like the EX, the S1 or S3. This can be handy depending on how fast you like things to go. Frankly, I find myself adjusting this a lot. It's dependent on the console though too, because each console has a little different encoders. And to go right along with that is encoder acceleration. So the faster you move the encoder, the more the fixtures might move as well. So it's kind of a dynamic change in the acceleration. Next is Grandmaster locked. So this will lock the Grandmaster at whatever setting it is at that time. So in this case, if I have the Grandmaster down a little bit and I go in there and I lock it at that point, it's going to lock my Grandmaster at the 83%. And it's going to tell me that's locked when I go to move it. I don't know anyone who locks it lower like that. I mean, you could, especially if you're trying to save lamplight on dimmers. Most times you'll see the Grandmaster will be locked at 100%. That can be helpful just to make sure that someone isn't bumping your Grandmaster and changing it on you. Page holdover when active. So what this means is when I change a page, if I have an active cue list here and I change a page, that active cue list is going to continue to stay here where I can see it. So in this case here, I have this cue list playing, and if I change the page, it still keeps that cue list right there. So what I like using this for is my stage look, or maybe my master cue list that I always want to have to be on the same playback all the time, but I still want to be able to page change to other ones. So when page holdover when active is enabled, this will not go away. So I can continue to still play that cue list, and then when I come back to the original page, it's still there. It's shown by this little triangle up here. I think we've made some adjustments to this too to make it a little easier to see. The only way to clear this, there's actually two ways to clear this. When it's active, if I get to the end of the cue list and I release it, it'll go away because it's no longer active. But if you also have a physical console in front of you, I can hit both the up and down arrows at the exact same time and it will clear that for me. I can't do it here because I don't have a console attached, and I can't hit two at the same time on the screen. So it's another nice little feature. Personally, I like to have it on all the time, but other people may not. And then also down here, we have inhibit fader jitter. This again is something to help with faders that might be a little sticky or you're starting to get some issues with them. We can turn that off or turn it up if the fader is really jittery. And the Q icons on playbacks, this is an option I think that is getting tweaked in the next build, so I'm not going to really spend any time on that one. So the next couple tabs here are things that we've worked on a little bit, maybe not serial directly, but if we have a serial interface, this is kind of the technical details of using serial interfaces for Vista. This is such a specific thing. I'm not going to get into it. So if you have any questions on this, shoot us an email and we'll go through it that way. MIDI, like what we did last week with our MIDI interfaces, here's where you set that up. Autosave. So some things have changed in Vista 3 with auto saving. It's a better system for auto saving your shows and auto backupping your shows. However, I still, it's not a replacement for manually saving your shows. But in the auto save tab, we can turn this on. So what it does is it's going to create a backup of the show file every 15 minutes and the backups you want to keep. So this is where I can set up that time interval. So if I really want to bring it down, I can, or also change the amount of backups. And this is also where I can say where that backup location is. So right now it's in my Vista 3 data shows folder, but if I wanted that to be a different location, like a Dropbox location, I guess, or a USB drive, I could change that so it's a physically different medium. So this is helpful right here as well. And what happens here is we create a backup every 15 minutes. I think the auto save, if I remember correctly, auto save happens in a lot quicker interval from that, happens every couple minutes. And then it turns the auto save into an auto backup after a certain amount of those. So this little icon up here will kind of show you what's happening when things go. It'll go red when it's trying to save, or a couple things there. I can't remember exactly what all of the color codes are for. But safe to say you want to make sure this is enabled. All right, in our playback tab, we've got some other settings. So a couple things here that I often will talk about in support if you have issues with certain fixtures that might not like fast DMX output. We can adjust that right here. So this says DMX updates per second. So this is the DMX frame rate. That's what's also known as, or just the DMX rate. 44 is the maximum of this on the DMX spec. A lot of times there might be fixtures that don't like that, so we can bring this down if we want to. This is hardware dependent. It doesn't work on every bit of Vista hardware, but it does work on the majority of the items, I believe. So again, if you have a fixture that's not operating properly, bring your DMX frame rate down. By default, it's not at 44. Here we go. Yep, by default, it's at 30. So it was bumped up for this show file. And 30 is pretty common. So some of the top things here, play research the entire cue list. So if I've got multiple cue lists playing and I have to play through one, this just is telling the cue list that, am I going to track everything forward, or am I going to only play the actual look that's in that queue? I think most people are used to this being on. So again, if it's a very specific case, you might need to turn it off or something. I can't think of anything in the top of my head. Reassert uses live time, so we could do that with the live time here. Spacebar acts as a play on the open Cuelist. This was a setting that was brought in on the last build of Vista, R1, I believe, where when we have a Cuelist that's active here, I can use my spacebar to play through it. Let's see. I gotta select it. Actually, why are you not working for me right now? Because I didn't hit it. There we go. This also works when we have one open for editing. It's very handy for having a Cuelist open and playing through it. Kind of the background of this one is it works like a lot of the audio and video editing softwares as well, where your spacebar stops and starts your timeline. And then home stops effects. If I hit the home on a parameter, it's going to stop the effect. At the bottom here, we've got the force refresh of all features. There is rarely any need to change this. The only time you'd need to really ever do anything with this is if you want to turn to never for a really old computer. But for most times, every computer can do this just fine. Always doesn't really add a lot extra to it. So every 2 seconds is the default. And that's kind of where I like to keep it as well. In our network tab, we've got access to some of our settings for networking. Something to bring up with this tab is this looks a little different when you've installed Vista in console mode. It has an extra couple of lines where we can actually set the IP address of the machine. So instead of having to get into the Windows background to adjust any of that stuff, we can set it right in here, and it would just expand this box up a little more and it'd say what the IP addresses are in the subnet mask. And here we have our Vista network. This is for tracking backup, whatever we're going to call this machine and whatever group it's going to be on. Each machine, kind of like the IP address, each machine have to have a unique name, but they'd all have to be in the same group. And then in network interface, this is where to choose which network interface we're using. So in this case, I just have the one. So I have this one to choose from. If I had multiple outputs or multiple network cards, I could choose other ones. Tracking backup, again, if we've got another backup system set up here, it's going to give us our times of when things are going to happen. So after 3 seconds is when Vista's going to realize, hey, the slave or the master has failed. And then once that hits, it's going to go and say, all right, how long till we fail over to the slave? So in this case, it's 20 seconds. So the entire time from the failure of the master to the slave taking over, in this case, would be the combination of both of these of 23 seconds. If that's too long for you, we can adjust this. You don't necessarily want to bring the timeout too much lower, because if you get it too low, just a simple real quick network glitch could cause things to all start going haywire. So this is kind of a good time here. The 20 seconds might be a little long depending on how fast your show is moving through. And at the bottom, we've got our ArtNet. So for broadcasting ArtNet, we've got some options here where we can do subnet directed, which is basically going to just this IP address and the devices that are in this range. So 1 through 255 would be getting the ArtNet, but nothing above that, none of these. ArtNet primary basically is a full-on broadcast. It's going to send ArtNet to everything that's on the 2 dot network. Secondary for the 10 dot, and then limited broadcast if we want to get into that. Normally, the only 2 I'd ever go to is subnet directed or maybe ArtNet primary. There's very little reason to go to anything else. And lastly, in standard Vista mode, our editing tab sets some of the default options for things that happen in store. So when I hit the store part window, these default selections here are driven by this default here. So if I wanted to change that, it would change these. And the queue deletion mode, when I get rid of a queue, how am I getting rid of it? That's the one. So by default, it's going to say by normal, And then I can select Q only if I wanted to, but if I always want to be Q only, I could select that there. And then the extract application mode, when we did this earlier on, when we create or play back an extract, it asks, how do you want it to be put into a queue, insert, merge, or prompt, which is why we get that pop-up each time. If you always have a way you want to do it, then you can set one of these and go on your way. Lastly, I can't show it in here because I'm not installed in console mode, but when you are installed in console mode, you have another tab here called Startup. And in that tab are the options of being able to start up other programs in Vista or other programs on the machine. So like RTP MIDI that we covered last week, where we have MIDI coming in over the network. In that startup tab, I can set that to start up the RTP MIDI program in the background to accept the MIDI commands in there. So if you need any help with that, shoot us an email and we can go through that, especially when we're on a machine with console mode set up. All right, well, that pretty much sums up our options and our preferences. Oh, I did forget one. We do have some Q properties as well. I should have hit that before I moved on. The Q properties are very similar to all the Cuelist properties. The one big one that's a little different here is the loop, where I can set this to loop through different queues. So if I wanted to loop back to Q1 and make that go a couple iterations and say, okay, I'm gonna get this little icon here. So now when I play through and get to the end of that one, it's gonna loop back to 2, and it's just gonna keep doing this until it hits the amount of iterations that I said, which I have no idea how many I did, so I'm not gonna keep going. 3 iterations. Alias queues, if I have any of these alias, I'm gonna see the list of which ones are in there. Blocking and tracking. So here's where we can adjust some of the blocking that we've done in the other ones, where we can tell which features we're blocking. I'm not going to go through this because we did the blocking earlier, but this is where we can adjust some of that stuff. Different effects operations. You can put audio in an individual queue if you want to. I'm not a fan of that. It's something that you could do if you wanted to play some sort of sound effect from a queue. The challenge here is that you can't, I don't believe you can have audio in a queue and also in the queue list at the same time. Or if you can, you might have some issues with that. And then your defaults as well. Defaults and notes as well on that one. Also in here is, I don't remember if we covered it, but we can ignore the learn timing. So last week when we were doing learn timing for queue lists, if you had a queue that was set the way you wanted it and you never wanted to change it, you could turn it on to ignore the learn timing. So it would not take anything you set when you're doing learn. All right, and with that, I have gone through all the properties I can think of. Well, again, thank you everybody for coming in and hanging out for a while, and we'll have another webinar tomorrow on some other fun stuff, and we'll see you there.